Hey, hi everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar broadcast today. We'll be spending the next hour or so talking about beavers in our landscape, looking a bit at their life history and ecology, as well as some management case studies. We have about an hour or just under that of content, and then a bit of Q&A time at the end. If you're not too familiar with the GoToWebinar software, it allows you to participate in a few ways. The first is live polls, which we'll be doing a few throughout the broadcast, so watch for those and you'll be able to respond on your own screen at home. The second is that you're able to ask questions. If you see there's a little hand icon on or a button on your right, if you click it, it allows you to ask questions by typing them in the chat space provided. We can see your questions and we'll try and respond to most of them at the end of the webinar if we have time. So maybe just for a quick technology check-in, for those of you that are here, can you raise your hand if you can hear me, and then let us know where you're participating from today in the chat box. Okay, so that seems to be working. Okay, I can hear you great. We've got some responses. Perfect. Okay, so we are the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society, better known as Cows and Fish. Some of you on the line I know are familiar with us, but for those of you that aren't, we're a nonprofit organization and a registered charity operating in Alberta, Canada. Myself and our 13 other staff strive to foster a better understanding of riparian areas for the benefit of those who use and value them, including agricultural producers, as the name Cows and Fish might suggest, and others who use them like urban, municipal, rural, acreage, cottage, or lakeshore, and their communities. Our approach is voluntary in nature, and it stems from the 3 pillars of environmental stewardship: building awareness, development of an ethic, and the resulting action. To learn more about how and who we work with, I invite you to visit our website or connect with us on social media. So just some introductions today to get us started. Today I have helping me here Christina Wantola, a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish in our Calgary office. She's offering up a bit of technology support and expertise today. We also have with us Brett Buchal with Alberta Environment and Parks. He's our guest panelist. We may hear a bit from Brett. We're not sure how much. We'll see what sort of questions and answers we get. But he's here to provide his expertise during the Q&A. But Brett's the senior biologist for the Bow District here in Alberta. He's worked as a government biologist for 12 years and has been in the Calgary area for the last 4. His work involves elk, grizzly bears, and a multitude of bird species. Working in this area with the people living in it, recreating and using the landscape requires an ability to understand the values in order to apply sound wildlife management decisions that will manage for both people and wildlife. And then myself, who's presenting the information we've compiled today. I'm Kelsey Spicer-Raw. I'm a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish in our Airdrie office. If you're not too familiar with Alberta, Airdrie is simply well, pretty much nowadays, it's a bedroom community of the city of Calgary. For the last 15 years or so, I've been working with landowners and communities to assess riparian areas, to work collaboratively to improve management and health, focused mostly in the parkland region of Alberta. So we thought we'd start with a poll. So Christine is going to give that a go to launch it. So what we wanted to ask you was, at this point, if you could rate your understanding of beaver ecology, management, and their role or influence on the landscape at the prior to the webinar, and we're going to ask you to remember your answer when you fill out the evaluation at the end of the webinar. The same question will be there, so we'd like you to kind of think about that for a minute or a few seconds and give us an answer, and hopefully remember that when it comes time for the evaluation. So we'll leave that poll open for a few more seconds and see what kind of answers we get. Okay, so we've got about 22% of us saying good, about 67% moderate, and about 6% in the poor range. So thanks for answering that, folks. So if we're called cows and fish, why are we talking about the beaver? And there's many reasons, but just a few I'll highlight today. The first is we have a new publication that was over a decade in the making. You'll see it pictured on your screen. It's called Beaver, Our Watershed Partner. It's authored and compiled by Lauren Fitch, our provincial biologist with cows and fish, and is 42 pages of beaver biology, ecology, their role in watershed function and health, how beaver can help us adapt to a changing climate, beaver as a watershed restoration tool, and thoughts on beaver management. Online, you'll also find our Pond of Gold fact sheet and a beaver management matrix for agricultural producers fact sheet. So quite a bit of the information that we'll cover today is found in the beaver booklet. So if you're looking for references for some of the research that's provided, a lot of it can be found in that. The second reason we talk about beaver today is we have a recent project that we're working with the Mistakis Institute in Calgary. We've secured some funding through the Calgary Foundation and the Government of Alberta's Watershed Resiliency and Restoration, or WRRP program, to build on past work and delve farther into some hands-on beaver management work, as well as education and outreach. It's a collaborative multi-year project called Putting Beavers to Work, and the overall goal of the project is to increase the awareness of the benefits beavers create for our watersheds and to increase willingness of landowners and land managers and policymakers to coexist with beaver. And lastly, but most importantly, this really isn't new territory for us. When I started with Cows and Fish in 2000, a draft beaver document already existed. We've always recognized beaver are a core part of our watershed function and health and have a large influence over the landscape we work on. We know that if we want to understand them, to recognize their role in watersheds, and figure out how to live with them, a good starting point is to educate ourselves and those we work with on their ecology, life history, and connections to watersheds. So the popular, or maybe not, beaver. I knew when headlines about beaver started hitting my news feed in the last few years that perhaps the popularity of this Canadian icon was on the rise. It might be due to Canada's 150th birthday, and Canadians are feeling a bit sentimental this year. Perhaps it's the interest in beaver relocation and reintroduction work across our continent and across the ocean. It could be recent droughts and floods, bringing watershed management to the forefront. I didn't really think it had much to do with the mapping of genomes, but if you follow the news, you never know what might show up. It could be any of these things or all of these things or something else entirely, but these little watershed engineers seem to be making their mark in more ways than just building dams and ponding water lately. But we know not all of the world has such patriotic fondness for the busy beaver. On a flight between Argentina and Chile in December 2000, my now husband and I sat quietly hiding our Canadian flags on our packs as a promotional video played. And this was back when all the passengers on the plane had to watch the same thing on that little screen that hung down from the overhead compartment. And the video showed the nasty beaver, the invasive Canadian beaver, that was introduced in 1946. The Argentine Navy imported about 10 beaver couples from Canada and set them free in the deep south of Tierra del Fuego, with the intention of enriching the native fauna and the local fur industry. The consequences were disastrous. They were protected from hunting for 35 years and devoid of natural predators. The beaver grew over 5,000 times their initial population, caused irreversible changes in the forest ecosystem, and started advancing over the continent. Their mistake? One Argentine interviewed on the subject suggests that maybe they should have brought in the bear as well. And they think they have a problem now, or at least they don't have to worry about this fellow. Cousin Castoro disappeared around the end of the last ice age. For Canadians, though, whether you love them or hate them, the beaver is featured prominently in many aspects of our life. From the nickel in your pocket, which we seem to have a bit more of lately with the Canadian mint dropping circulation and use of the penny, to hundreds of place names, towns, rivers, municipalities, all across Canada and Alberta, this speaks to our heritage, our history, but it's also a nod to the ecology of the nation. Fashion in the 1500s through the 1800s created a rage in Europe for beaver hats. Beaver fur was the prime ingredient in the manufacture of felt, which was perfect for the creation of the beaver hat in various styles and shapes. With the virtual elimination of the European beaver, the search for pelts shifted to North America. It's notable that someone's fashion statement on the other side of the Atlantic would drive the exploration, transition, and commerce of a continent for several centuries, but it did just that. During the early 1800s, 500,000 beaver pelts were shipped to Europe each year. Our nation was essentially built on the back of beaver. David Thompson said, "Every intelligent man could see the destruction that would follow if the beaver was overtrapped. A barren field can be made whole again with the use of manure, but the beaver once destroyed cannot be replaced. It's the gold coin of the country." In Canada today, we don't value beaver so much for their fur, but we appreciate them for their ability to store water, a commodity far more precious and valuable. So let's take a look at a few of the key linkages between our beaver and our watersheds. Given 10,000 or more years of dam building successively upon upstream from lower reaches and repeating the process as old ponds become filled in with sediment, beaver have had and continue to have profound effects on changing stream gradients, elevating stream channels, changing cross-sectional valley profiles, and aiding riparian vegetation. Over time, beaver activity changes a steep gradient that we see in 1 into a flatter stair-stepped one in 2, and widens the valley that we see in the picture 3. Deep, rich soils from centuries of sediment capture, sub-irrigated with high water tables, create fertile valley bottoms we see in 4. So essentially, stream valleys that were once V-shaped and steep-sloped are transformed by beaver activity into wider U-shaped valleys with gentler gradients. Losing beaver from our watershed may cause erosion to increase and streams to downcut, reversing the process that's begun decades earlier. We know that beaver ponds act as natural water filters, trapping and storing tons of sediment, improving water quality downstream for humans, but also for fish. Erosion is a natural process, but as our land uses increase, the sediment load produced exceeds the range of natural variation, usually by several orders of magnitude. The sources are numerous. They include things like roads, trails, cut blocks, and cultivated fields, among others. Beaver dams capture and store much of this sediment. The range is from 35 to 6,500 meters cubed per pond. At the upper end of that limit, at 6,500 meters cubed, this represents 382 tandem dump truck loads of sediment stored in each dam. We know that up to 90% of the finer sediment load in a stream can be captured by beaver ponds. Even when beaver colonies are abandoned and dams are breached, most of the sediment stays in that riparian area. Fresh sediment is rapidly colonized by vegetation, which over time captures even more sediment. So with respect to water quality, downstream of each pond, the filtering effect is profound. Each pond acts as a natural water treatment plant. Up to 75% less suspended solids, up to 60% less phosphorus, up to 25% less nitrogen, up to 23% of carbon sequestered, and reduced fecal coliforms. We all know that beavers store water, but the extent to which they do that, that's often where the story lies. So, beaver activity increases the amount of open water at a landscape level by 9%. David Suzuki in the CBC show The Beaver Whisperers relates this to the fact that if we had a pond the size of Ontario and added beaver to it, the result would be a pond with surface water the size of Canada. Beaver dams increase the wetted width of streams by up to 30%, and the wetted perimeter of wetlands increases by an average of 575%. Between 30 to 60% of the water in a watershed is held in beaver dams. So it's quite a significant amount. And if we look at a beaver pond the size of 40 by 50 meters, the area it could influence can exceed 1 kilometer square. But if you consider the water that we can't see, the groundwater, it moves laterally and is stored beneath the channel and the pond. It's also moves adjacent to the pond and upstream and downstream of the pond. This process of surface water retention behind the dam, shallow groundwater storage, and slow release contributes to enhancing downstream flows, essentially helping to keep streams flowing and wetlands wet. They can help mitigate the effects of drought and the loss of wetland and riparian habitats. Beaver ponds both store and deliver water. By slowing water down, allowing groundwater capture, downstream flows can be enhanced 2 to 10 times over those streams without beaver ponds. Most important, that water is delivered in normal low flow periods when fish and downstream water users need it most. So you can picture dams and ponds as speed bumps for streams, discouraging that stream from speeding along. Who wouldn't want to decrease the risk and cost of major floods and slow the rate of erosion on the land? Beaver ponds increase the size of the effective floodplain by up to 12 times. This makes the floodplain wider and able to detain, restrain, and slow down that speeding water. Dams reduce stream velocity and power. This has profound implications on slowing the rate of downstream erosion. Beaver ponds can decrease stream velocity by up to 81% and reduce stream power by 92%. The real virtue of beaver dams and ponds isn't necessarily in storage, but in slowing down the flood peak and the energy associated with it. This is the roughness coefficient. It dampens the velocity and discharge rates. So beavers act as our little resilience engineers that build opportunity for the stream system to rebound quickly after floods and droughts. We know that the overall ability of beaver dams to slow floodwaters is variable and can depend on how big the flood is, the size of the watershed above the pond, the number and size of ponds along the way, how full the ponds are before the flood. But as the number of ponds increase, the ability to capture more of the flood flow is enhanced. There was one study that showed that 5 ponds in series reduced peak flows of a flood by 14% for a 1 to 2 year flood event and by 4% for a 1 to 50 year event. Beaver activity also helps to control the thermostat of the watershed. Much of the stream water captured by ponds is stored in underground shallow aquifers and may re-enter the channel downstream. This keeps water temperatures cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter to benefit fish. There's a lag between the time water enters the pond, is absorbed as groundwater, and its eventual release. This lag can be up to 3 months. Water tends to emerge from groundwater sources cooler than it went in, and that benefits fish, especially some of the trout species we have here in Alberta. And lastly, we know that beaver workings contribute substantially to the complexity, connectivity, and vegetation diversity of landscapes, which translates to many more opportunities for wildlife species on, near, and beneath the surface of beaver ponds. If you're familiar with cows and fish, you've probably heard the statistics before. Riparian areas are a magnet for fish and wildlife. About 80% of our fish and wildlife populations depend on 2% of the landscape called riparian for all or part of their life cycle requirements, and beavers enhance that 2%. So whether we're talking about rare species or common species, the list of them that are benefited from beaver is quite long. So in summary, beavers in our watersheds modify channel geomorphology and hydrology, increase retention of sediment, create and maintain wetlands, modify nutrient cycling, modify and increase riparian zones, influence water quality, and modify habitat. So with an understanding of the benefits, why is it that we can't get along with beaver? Two things, time and space. It seems we don't have the capacity to give up either one of the requisites of ecological progression. Typically, Mr. Beaver just makes us angry with his industriousness, his wanton destruction. Usually it's hard to love him, and as a result, this is sometimes our reaction. A little dynamite goes a long way toward restoring our sense of ecological aesthetics. It's a complicated relationship with the beaver, and one that is difficult to find a balance. At Cows and Fish, through working with many landowners in the province, we have a good sense of the struggles to live with beaver and the tricky nature of trying to answer how many beaver are too many, how many beaver are enough. We see both sides of the coin, or the nickel, so to speak, when it comes to beaver management, but also through working with many landowners in the province, struggling through ecological shifts, including 2 major droughts since 2000, we know of the appreciation for beaver as well. Already 2 years into what turned out to be a 4-year drought, our rancher friend Dixon Hammond took one of my colleagues for a walk, not along his creek, but down his creek. Dixon and so many other landowners we work with tell how thankful they are to the beaver for providing the only standing water on their entire ranch in times of drought. I think we all agree that this is not necessarily a pretty sight. But if we are truly motivated to allow ecological processes to remain part of our landscape evolution, if we're interested in not only maintaining what's left of our riparian areas, floodplains, and wetlands in a shifting climate, but perhaps restoring what we have lost, then we need to give up a little of 2 things, time and space. Sorry, there we go. Slide wasn't advancing. So where and how does our friend the beaver fit, and what tools are available to help us get along? Let's look at some examples of how we might better coexist with beaver and how jurisdictions across North America are utilizing the beaver to help restore watersheds. The first case study I want to discuss is from Eastern Washington, where the Lands Council is working hard to promote and implement its beaver solution approach to address late season regional water scarcity concerns. Eastern Washington is home to about 50,000 beaver, compared to a one-time high of perhaps 5 million. The impetus for the project came out of a 2006 House bill, commonly referred to as the Columbia River Basin Water Management Program. One of the objectives of the program is to provide an additional 3 million acre-feet of water storage in the basin to benefit people, farms, and fish during low flow periods of the year. In no small part because of landscapes having degraded ability to store spring runoff, there is currently reduced late season flows in the Columbia River when peak water demand occurs. Because of rising temperatures, the snowpack is melting earlier and earlier, causing trillions of gallons of fresh water to gush down from the mountains, overwhelming streams and sluicing over ground too fast to nourish the ecosystem. To avoid the state from having to spend millions on engineered hard infrastructure solutions like dams and reservoirs, the Lands Council received funds to do a feasibility study looking into putting beavers to work to strengthen Eastern Washington's natural green infrastructure capacity to store water and restore watershed function. So they undertook a year-long study to quantify the amount of water that could be stored by reintroducing beaver into 12 Eastern Washington counties. Their research focused on 2 objectives. One was to quantify the volume of water stored behind existing beaver dams in the study area, and the second was to identify and quantify in miles the stream segments that had suitable habitat for beaver currently. So the Lands Council study determined that beaver dams in Eastern Washington each had the potential to store between 17.5 and 35 acre-feet of water. An acre-foot of water is the amount of water that 1 foot deep spread over 1 acre of land would be. Their habitat suitability analysis for beaver evaluated streams based on slope, elevation, stream order, and transportation proximity. And the results showed that over 9,000 miles of stream met all of these physical criteria. An additional analysis to estimate vegetation availability, so there was food available for the beaver, found that about 70% of these stream miles had sufficient vegetation for beaver. So their final estimates showed that beaver can potentially store between 2 and 4 million acre-feet of water in eastern Washington, which hit the mark. They were looking for about 3 million acre-feet. So it led them to conclude that natural storage reservoirs can be developed through beaver reintroduction on tributaries of the Columbia River as a cost-effective alternative to building large dams. So to help promote the idea, they created this cute, albeit a tiny bit cheesy video called the Beaver Solution. And if you search on YouTube, we're not going to show it today, but if you search on YouTube for the Beaver Solution video, you'll be able to come up with it. It's just a few minutes long, maybe 3 or 4, but it's worth a watch. So their efforts did seem to pay off. In 2012, Washington State approved the Beaver Bill, or House Bill 2349. Among other provisions, the bill allows nuisance beavers to be live trapped and relocated to areas where they can create natural dams to store water and to improve stream flows. The bill also allows private entities to be able to do the trapping and the relocation. So this bill really set the stage for the Lands Council to continue in its endeavor to look at the next phases of its Beaver Solution project, which included selecting specific beaver reintroduction sites with agency and landowner approval, which is pretty important. And secondly, beginning a pilot reintroduction project, which will involve a monitoring component to assess success or failure, and then build support for additional reintroductions in subsequent years. Cows and Fish has been working with the Lands Council to gather further information on the success and the benefits of this relocation work. We haven't got a lot of new information to report yet, but there was a 2016 article in the Atlantic titled "Leave It to Beaver" that reports up to 45 beaver had since been relocated in the area. It's interesting to note that beaver reintroduction is not really new to North America. As early as 1928, Gray Owl, who was the original beaver believer, established his first colony with 2 baby beavers he found in the backwoods of Canada. In the 1940s, the state of Idaho's Department of Fish and Game embarked on a reintroduction method larger in scale and somewhat unexpected in method, finding the long and dusty backroad trips a bit too hard on the beaver that they were relocating. The department then chose to drop them by parachute into dry and parched corners of the state. Apparently, this worked. In 1950, a report from 1950 notes that of the 76 beavers airdropped in the fall of 1948, only 1 perished. The others began building dams, establishing colonies, and storing water. My grandfather was a paratrooper during the war, and the man who I knew that was not much of a risk taker, but at one time in his life must have hurtled himself out of airplanes into combat. And after reading this story about the parachuting beaver, I often wondered if or when my grandfather had read this news story, he may have thought to himself, well, you know, if a beaver did it, surely there was no reason why I couldn't. We haven't talked a lot about beaver biology, but we do know that the coat of the beaver is comprised of a thick underfur and longer guard hairs, which not only is suitable for hats, but also allows the beaver to thrive in widely varying climates. So the coat's rugged enough for the beaver to survive Canadian winters and sort of linger below the surface of frozen ponds. But it's also light enough to keep the animal cool during hot summers in places like Utah, which is where our next case study takes us. So Utah is another U.S. jurisdiction looking to take a different approach to beaver management in recognition of the benefits they can offer. In 2010, the state of Utah developed their first beaver management plan. It aimed to maintain healthy, functional beaver populations, promote an increased awareness of and appreciation for the role of beaver in Utah's ecosystems, and promote consistency in how government agencies currently handle beaver management challenges, including promoting broader use of non-lethal beaver management responses. An important component of the plan was to identify areas of potential beaver reintroduction to restore degraded watersheds. So one of the basins that they identified as a good candidate for beaver reintroduction was the Escalante Watershed. This basin covers about 2,000 square miles and is located in southern Utah. The watershed historically did support beaver, but beaver are pretty rare in the region now. In 2011, under the direction of the Grand Canyon Trust, they undertook an economic valuation study of beaver ecosystem services in the Escalante River Basin in Utah. The study was pretty interesting in that it found tremendous economic benefits could result from beaver ecosystem services. So examples include sediment retention services, if multiplied out on a basin-wide scale, could amount to 6.7 to 8.4 million per year. And like most ecological goods and services studies, the economic valuation of nature is often measured in costs that are avoided. So basically for this, for the sediment retention, it's based on estimated avoided sediment dredging costs for downstream reservoirs. Also taking into account water retention capacities of beaver dams and potential for increasing beaver dam density upstream. These dams could augment the reservoir at Wide Hollow water storage capacity by a dollar figure equivalent of 4.8 to 6 million per year. And again, these are avoided costs, in this case for reservoir expansion projects. And when they looked at wetland and riparian habitat, some of the cumulative values associated with those, when beaver dams create wetland and riparian habitat, it's estimated to have ecological service values getting into the hundreds of millions of dollars per year. There's also quite a bit of work being done by Utah State University. They've developed a Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, or BRAT. The tool looks at modeling existing and historic habitat capacity for beavers and prioritizes areas based on beaver riparian habitat recovery potential. And also, I think this is an important part, the potential for human conflict. So using the model, they've classified various beaver management zones across the state to help guide restoration, public education, and beaver relocation efforts. So about 35% of the state was categorized sort of as what they were calling low-hanging fruit. And that was streams that had habitats that were either currently inhabited by beaver or are in relatively good condition for beaver recolonization or reintroduction. There's also an app for that. They developed a citizen science app to track beaver dam locations and infer population numbers, which is kind of a neat way to get the public involved as well. So the Grand Canyon Trust works closely to help fund these and other research projects, and has developed various online tools to promote beaver best management practices aimed at beaver coexistence or translocation where possible, and promoting that. But if you look online, you can find quite a bit more information about these two examples that we've provided. I think it is important to note that evaluation of these relocation efforts and their benefits that they've provided long-term to water storage or to other things like fish in both Washington and Utah are not well documented to date. Beaver relocation efforts definitely need to be considered thoughtfully and carefully, both for the safety of the animal, but also to manage human conflicts and to weigh the benefits. So we have a second poll for you to answer, which Christine is going to launch. She has launched now. So this one is, have you used any non-lethal or non-destructive beaver management tools, like pond levelers, which if you don't know what that is, we'll be getting into it shortly, barrier fencing, scent marking, or others? Leave that open just for a few more seconds. Okay, so we have some people that have, which is great. So about 38% say yes. About the same say no. I didn't know about these options. And 13 about no, but I hope to in the future. And then a few others in the remaining categories there. So great. Thank you for participating in that. Interesting to see what other work is going on. This case study I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is one that was featured in a CBC Nature of Things documentary called The Beaver Whisperers. It is available online. There's a link there showing at the bottom there. And if you haven't watched it, it's really worth a watch. So this one was from Gatineau Park, Quebec, and it really is thanks to the ingenuity and persistence of the fellow here, Michael Leclerc. He was the animal conservation officer in the park. He manages, the managers at the park no longer face a perpetual battle of blowing up dams or trapping beavers, but instead have found other and less costly and sustainable solutions to management. So this park, Gatineau Park, is one of the densest populations of beaver in North America, being home to about 300 colonies of beaver on over 360 square kilometers. The park has had a long history of trapping and blowing dams, but despite these expensive strategies, they've had reoccurring issues with beaver, as often once they were trapped out, new beaver simply moved into those vacant territories. So after spending a lot of time studying and observing the beaver and the beaver's behavior, Michael Leclerc learned to understand the cues for their dam building habitats a bit better. He's since designed and installed more than 200 water control devices in Gatineau Park, in addition to using pond levelers, which I'll explain about in the next case study, and beaver deceivers to keep beavers out of culverts. He's also strategically placed fence posts in the water to create the sound of rushing water, which promoted beavers to build dams where he wants them to and not where he doesn't want them to. So the show says Leclerc's ingenuity has virtually eliminated the negative impacts beaver have had on the park's infrastructure and ended the practice of trapping as a means of controlling the population. So if you haven't seen that documentary, definitely have a look for it online. We're down just two more case studies that we'd like to profile. And this one sort of brings us back to beaver in the headlines in the Calgary area anyway. In the fall of 2016, Cows and Fish and the Mistakis Institute invited the fur bearers, Adrian Nelson, to instruct a hands-on workshop in the city of Calgary and the MD Foothills that attracted some positive attention from media outlets. I think we had about 4 media outlets present that day, which is pretty good for an environmental story. So basically, to beat the beaver at its own busy nature, we installed one pond leveler, one exclusion device, and one combination device between 2 different sites in the city of Calgary at Griffith Wood Park, and in the MD Foothills. So a pond leveler, essentially, you can see it pictured there. The tubing is extended through the dam, and the upstream or pond end is sunk with a large cage around it to avoid blockages, so the beaver can't block that end. Water is allowed to keep flowing through the dam at a desired rate, and then water can continue to flow at a desired level, keeping the beaver in place, but mitigating the risk of flooding or infrastructure damage. Beavers can't plug the hole, and they actually tend to build the pipe right into their dam. This photo was taken actually a few weeks after the workshop, and the beaver had quite tidied up the site. She had placed more branches over the pipe where it entered the culvert. So you can kind of get a feel. There's where the pipe enters the culvert is a footpath that was used for recreational purposes and prone to flooding. The second one we installed in Griffith Wood Park was an exclusion fence. So this was basically just heavy gauge fencing in sort of a pentagonal shape that forces the beaver away from the culvert. And really, they were both fairly easy to install. It was actually amazing that the materials, once they were on site, and with the number of people we had, there was probably about 20 of us there. We were able, but usually it was only a handful of people working on the actual construction and install. Within about 5 hours that day, we were able to build and install both of these devices that we just showed you. So it was really quite quick. Some of the other lessons learned from the hands-on workshop was that, of course, power tools always make people smile. Some of us don't always get the opportunity to use power tools in our work, and there was lots of people that were willing to jump in line and get those on board. You do need to consider upstream and downstream impacts when choosing your places and locations to install these, and any potential conflicts. And each one is a bit different, with some trial and error to basically fit the device in place. So depending on your bottom, stream substrate, and culvert size, and all sorts of things, there's a little bit of fiddling that sometimes needs to be done. So the next one is a combination install that we did in the MDF foothills, and this was a beaver exclusion fence at the upstream end of the culvert, with a pond leveler installed as well. And this one, you can see the picture on the right. We did have to have permission to access land on both sides. The beaver dam that you can see there on the right did have to be breached in order for us to get the water levels down a little bit before the install could take place. So there was a bit of fiddling around with that at the start. But really the outcomes of this project is in the Calgary area. We now have a community of practitioners that includes both government, municipal, non-government, and wildlife management. There was actually some private company staff present that work in wildlife management there. And we know for sure that since the workshop, the city of Airdrie has installed a pond leveling device on Nose Creek, and the city of Calgary has installed a few more of these as well. We also now have a materials list to construct both the pond leveler and the exclusion fence, and ideas on locations of where these materials are able to be purchased. Our staff took really detailed notes, so we have those written up, and hopefully to ensure that we can maybe replicate this process again in the future, especially now that we have that community of practitioners. We should be able to replicate these things. And then there are some videos. I didn't post the link to the videos, but there was some from the Mistakis Institute and the Fur Bearers that day that you may be able to find. The Fur Bearers video, there's a really good one that they have on their website that shows or explains more about the pond leveling devices and how they get installed. And then we just thought we'd put a plug in here, and again for an upcoming webinar on April 6th. If you go to the Fur Bearers websites and look at their webinars, this one is on flow devices for beaver management for landscape managers. So the last case study that I wanted to talk about today is another Alberta-based project, and this one started in 2014. It's a partnership between Beaver County and the University of Alberta. So if you're not familiar with Beaver County, it's located approximately 45 minutes east and south of the city of Edmonton. The population of the county is only about 5,000 to 6,000 residents. It's home to the towns of Tofield and Viking, if that helps you place it on the map any. They do have about 2,600 kilometers of local road and a somewhat diversified tax base, some acreage developments in the far west, also mixed farming in the center and the east, and a little bit of oil and gas as well. So their project goals for this one were to install and test the effectiveness of pond leveling devices at some of the areas with chronic flooding in their county. Looking at also a cost-benefit analysis for doing these types of management. They also did a survey, which I'm not going to talk about today. They also collected a lot of data in terms of ecological assessments associated with where the locations of the install was. And they did a lot of mapping to look at sort of what the current distribution of beaver lodges and beaver occupied sites were in the county. So We're all probably pretty familiar with the problems the busy beaver can create, and in Beaver County, they were pretty similar to other Alberta municipalities. This is a road or a vehicle trail in Elk Island National Park, and you can see that not only have they flooded out some of the road surface, but they've actually channeled through that road surface as well. And again, culvert issues similar to other municipalities and jurisdictions in the province, and I'm sure across our nation and others. It included things like flooded culverts that would often freeze in the winter, or just blocked culverts that required man time and equipment to clear them and maintain flows. So they had, up till this point, Beaver County had used traditional methods, blasting, also backhoe trapping, hand bombing, but they knew that there were some drawbacks to these traditional methods: high costs. They were often temporary fixes. There was often biodiversity and wetland impacts, and there was sometimes landowner resistance as well. So before they started looking at or installing the pond levelers, they did a bit of on the ground and in the office pre-planning and site mapping. So this was to identify current and recurrent areas of concern with regard to beaver, assessing upstream and downstream impacts, mapping locations of beaver lodges, and whether they were inactive or active colonies. In that first year, in 2014, they installed 9 pond leveling devices in the county. In addition, they installed at least one in Provincial Grazing Reserve, the Cooking Lake Blackfoot, and another 2 inside the city of Camrose, which is a nearby city, in agreement with Beaver County. So after all of that, they were able to do their cost-benefit analysis. And this is kind of where it gets a bit interesting. So they were basically adding up all the costs of managing a particular site normally, like the backhoe, the dynamite, hiring a trapper, replacing infrastructure, and then they compare it to managing the costs of managing that site with flow devices. So with the help of the U of A, they put it into a cost-benefit model and were able to calculate some of this. So they found that of the 12 devices that they installed in 2014, they would save about $80,000 over 3 years. So a pretty significant savings. So, and this only reflects the savings for managers. So the benefit of these devices is much higher if you were to add in the social discount rate that puts value on facilities over time, as well as social value to park users who see a lot of benefits in being able to use dry trails. To build one of these pond leveling devices, their materials totaled about $500, and then after material prep, installation labor, transportation, they would come in around at $1,000 for one site, but it would vary depending on the amount of materials they require. So you can see that there is quite a lot of savings that is being put into place by utilizing some of these different flow devices. One of the other nice things that they have done, and I know the City of Calgary was doing this as well, where they had done their installs, was including a bit of a social aspect and an education aspect. So they did that survey, but they also extended some information about the device through signage at some of the device locations, so that the public can get a feel for what this is and why it's there and how it might work. So we have a third poll that Christina will launch, and this one is just asking about, so we covered a few different beaver management tools, but are there some others, or what are the ones that you are most interested in learning about, recognizing that maybe not all the options are listed here? So we'll leave that open for just a little bit longer. And it looks like interest is pretty varied, which is good. 73% fencing and exclusion barricades, 40% pond leveling devices, 47% tree wrapping. Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the case studies, and we'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A as well as just some acknowledgements and some up-and-coming stuff. I wonder if we want to do some Q&A, and okay. So Christine and I are just going to go through the questions. So somebody has asked how beavers were in North America prior to European settlements. Or I'm guessing they're asking how many beaver were in North America prior to European settlement and how many are left today. I don't think I have the answer to that off the top of my head, but we could probably get back to you with an answer for that. Somebody has asked if we've linked all the studies online. I haven't provided links to every single one. Most of them did have a link in them. If you can't find it, if you go to that Beaver R Watershed Partnership document that I showed at the very beginning of the webinar, it's available on the Cows and Fish website. In the references in there, you'll be able to find some more references to that. And the slide deck and the recording should be available at the end of the webinar as well to view. So if you weren't able to write down some of those links, you should be able to find them afterwards. Okay, those were, Kirby, one of our staff who's online. Thanks, Kirby. Kirby says 12 to 20 million beaver in North America prior to colonization. Who can we contact to get help to install a pond leveler? So you could start with your local municipality. They may or may not be familiar with the device. You can look online and watch the Fur Bearers, that upcoming webinar on pond levelers, to learn a little bit more about them to see if you think that your site is a potential candidate. But if you want to chat with us after the webinar, definitely get in contact with one of us and we can try and help you out with that. Okay. So that's sort of the list, the end of the questions. If you guys do have questions at any time, I'll have my contact information up at the end. Brett is on the line with us as well from Alberta Environment, but Brett, there weren't too many questions related to regulatory or policies, so we will leave you. I'm going to turn your sound on, Brett. Brett, are you still there?
Thank you very much, Kelsey. Yes, I am. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Would you like to provide comment? There wasn't any specific questions, but I'll give you a few minutes if you'd like to comment. Oh, just wait, Christina's got, there is a question. What is the province's beaver relocation policy?
The province does not have a beaver relocation policy.
Okay. Is there any consideration in place or what's the status?
I would say right now that for the most part in Alberta, we have a healthy and sustainable population of beavers. As you alluded to earlier, Kelsey, translocating an animal puts stress on the animal as well, and typically we reserve those for more at-risk species such as sage-grouse and even grizzly bear, for an example. Typically, we have not resulted in translocation for other species that are apparently secure in the province. So I would expect that a policy would not be forthcoming. Rather, actually, I'm fairly encouraged by both what you're saying and even the response from the polls, where people are looking to prevent conflict from before it even happening by installing pond levers, by looking at other mitigations they can do, tree wrapping, in order to prevent the conflict from occurring in the first place, which therefore negates the need to trap the beaver. So I'm quite encouraged by those approaches.
Great. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, and good luck.
Thanks. Okay, so it looks like we will wrap up now. Thanks everyone for your participation. Just a couple of things to note before we close the webinar completely. As part of our collaborative project with the Mistakis Institute, Cows and Fish has an upcoming survey that may reach your inbox or your mailbox in the near future if you live in Alberta. We recognize that people have a diverse range of knowledge about beaver and their management, as well as a wide range of attitudes and behaviors toward beavers. And we're doing a survey to better understand Albertans' knowledge and attitudes. So this will help us plan and be more effective with future awareness and management efforts, as well as to build more tolerance to beavers as a watershed restoration tool while understanding the challenges they pose. So if you're, that I think is underway, and it should be going out, I think what I heard last was within the next few weeks. So unfortunately it is only for those in Alberta, but the results will be probably relevant to other provinces as well. Secondly, if you are in Alberta and interested in a workshop similar to what we've presented today, but in a bit longer time space, sort of a morning or an afternoon, with more detail on biology and life history, possibly more case studies and that sort of thing, and sometimes a field component as well, we are available for that. Just get in touch with us. And also we talked about the Flow Devices for Managers webinar on April 6th. There's a link there as well. And then after the webinar, there'll be an evaluation link that will be sent to you. So we'd really appreciate it. This is our first webinar that Cows and Fish has done. So we'd actually really appreciate it if you could provide us with some feedback so that if we end up using this as an extension tool in the future, again, we have some good feedback. Okay, so my contact, we'd covered the questions already. My contact is listed there below, and I think it was listed on the poster as well for the webinar. And it's also available on our Cows and Fish website. And then lastly, just a slide to show some acknowledgements for some of the content, as well as some of the imagery that you've seen today in the presentation. So we just would like to thank you so much for your time, and it is 2 o'clock, so we finished just a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great. I didn't really want to keep you a whole hour and a half. If you do have questions after the event, there's probably a few that we didn't get to. We will try and answer those. If you stay on the line, we'll try and answer those for you as well via the chat box. And if not, we'll get back to you later on with an answer. So thanks very much, folks, and we'll talk to you all again.